Bosses used to be tuned so that the best guilds in the world would kill them early on with lower gear, and then, as people slowly geared up throughout the course of the content cycle, you would eventually reach a point where more gear would somewhat trivialize some of the mechanics that made the bosses so bleeding edge difficult to execute for the best players in the world. But now, because of Hey, what up? Jericho here. And today I want to talk about one of the most important parts of World of Warcraft and MMORPGs in general, and that's how do you get the best gear? Make item level number go up is definitely a big motivation for a lot of people playing, so the rules the game sets out on how you make this number go up will eventually determine how people interact with and participate in the endgame loops throughout the course of a season or an expansion. What I'm curious to see today is how has this actually changed and evolved over time? Now, some of you that didn't play Classic might not even remember this, but up to 8 years ago, the loot you got from dungeons was actually considered a way to get your character ready to go to the raids where the really cool and powerful and best stuff actually dropped. Now, this of course all changed at the launch of Legion. We got the Mythic Plus system, and now you have an alternative to raiding to gear up your character that gave you loot to rival the heroic or even mythic versions of the raid. But how has the pace of gearing and relative incentives between doing dungeons on the one hand and raids on the other changed over time? Well, just to pick an arbitrary starting point as a reference, by the time the Great Vault was introduced at the beginning of Shadowlands, the heroic raid dropped item level 213 for the first 7 bosses and 220 for the last 2, while the mythic version dropped 226 and 233 respectively. As for Mythic Plus, completing a plus 15 gave you a 210 item level at the end of the run, and filling your weekly vault slots with 14s or higher gave you a choice of up to 3 226 item level items. Okay, so that's where we're starting from. Doing Mythics gives you a spammable source of good gear, but you will always have upgrades from the heroic version of the raid. And the Great Vault is a steady source of Mythic raid level gear, but it takes months and a lot of luck to get to the point where you have no item level upgrades from the first 7 bosses, and you will always have the motivation of an extra 7 item levels, including weapons, from the last 2 bosses on the Mythic difficulty of the raid. Now let's look at how this has changed since. If we fast forward to the start of Dragonflight in Season 1, the end of Dungeon Mythic Plus rewards now scale to 405 for doing a plus 19, which granted is harder at this point at least than doing a plus 15 was back in Shadowlands, which is higher than the first 4 bosses drop on the heroic difficulty of the raid. Not only that, but you now have the Valor system that basically means you know that you'll be able to increase the item level of this gear over the course of the season, granted that you have the required Mythic Plus rating. So for example, someone who has a 2200 Mythic Plus rating, which means they can basically spam 16s, knows that they will eventually have a full set of 411 gear and virtually no item level upgrades from the entire raid on Heroic. Similarly, someone who can do plus 18s and has 2400 Mythic Plus rating will eventually end up with full 415 gear and no upgrades from the first 3 bosses on the Mythic difficulty of the raid, except things like the rare ring from Aranog or the icon trinket from Council. As for the weekly vault, this gives 421 item levels, same as the mid-mythic bosses, and 3 item levels lower this time than the last 2 bosses on Mythic. On top of this, the Spark system was introduced alongside the otherwise interesting revamp to Professions, where you basically get a spark of ingenuity pretty much passively every 2 weeks, that you can use to craft a 421 item level item of your choice. Now this is essentially another source of mid-mythic raid gear that you get throughout the course of the season on top of your weekly vault without having to participate in the raid at all. Also worth noting, tier sets that give a big boost to your character's power had just recently made a comeback in Sepulchre at this point, but remember that your weekly vault slots for Mythic Plus also have a chance of randomly giving you a tier item, and we also have the Catalyst now that periodically gives you charges that you can use to turn any item into a tier item. So while getting your tier is back as a motivation to participate in the raids, this only serves as such for the first few weeks before people accumulate enough Catalyst charges or get lucky on their weekly vaults. Which brings us to Season 2, where in my opinion things really start to get weird. You see, this season introduced the Flightstone upgrade system, where gear now essentially drops in one of several upgrade tracks. Each of these has a maximum upgrade level, and you need various types of crests to do the upgrading. Now, here are the loot tables for gear that dropped in Normal, Heroic, and Mythic and Aberrus, but while this looks like a lot of numbers, remember that within 4 or 5, maybe 6 weeks, basically everyone who has been playing has enough crests to fully upgrade most of this. And not only that, but if you fall behind, the weekly cumulative cap on crests means that you can just spam keys to catch up at any time. So at this point, normal effectively drops 437 champion gear, heroic drops 441 hero gear, and mythic drops 441 through 450 unupgradable at the start at least mythic gear. So now somebody that does the raid on normal would look forward to only a 4 item level increase in the medium term by doing heroic, and for the first time getting all the stuff from the heroic raid now means that you probably don't need anything from the first 3 bosses on mythic. As for Mythic Plus, doing a plus 18 gave you hero gear that you could quickly upgrade to heroic 441 item level, this time a bit faster than with the Valor Point season in Season 1 and with no rating requirement this time, so you would again get to a point where you no longer needed anything from the first bosses on the mythic difficulty of the raid. Also new to Season 2 was the Omni token that you get for killing the last boss in Heroic or achieving a certain M+ or PvP rating that gave you a token you could exchange for a tier item of your choice. Now this was mainly done to appease the people complaining about getting gate kept during the first few weeks of the season from Mythic Plus or PvP because they had bad luck on getting their tier set bonus, and while this did sort of solve that problem, the end result is that basically everybody is going to be full tier in the first 1 to 3 weeks of the season. And to be honest with you, in 19 years of playing this game, this is by far the fastest I've ever been done fully equipping my character at the beginning of the season. By the middle of week 3, I was already in full pre-mythic 441 or above raid bis by just clearing the raid on normal and heroic twice, doing mythic plus to fill my vault, using my first 2 crafting sparks, and admittedly being pretty lucky on my first 2 weekly vaults. Just so you get how crazy this was, at this point, the only upgrade I had until the 6th boss on mythic difficulty was a 444 trinket that I already had in 441. So at this point, in terms of gearing up my character, I was done and I could go to just logging in 4 times a week for my raid and doing a few Mythic Plus dungeons to fill up my vault, just in time as Diablo 4 released. Now, I'm sure this had nothing to do with it, but yes, I am implying that Blizzard unleashed a gearing bonanza at the start of Season 2 of Dragonflight, so that people would be done within the first 3 weeks gearing their character and have enough time to make sure that they play Diablo 4 on release. I don't know, maybe I have my tinfoil hat on too tight on that one, but I'll let you decide. And that brings us to the current soon-to-be-over Season 3. We have now reached the end of our journey and masked behind all the systems and the numbers. We are now at a point where a character that only does Mythic Plus 18s and never touches the raid will have effectively the same item level as a cutting-edge raider within a few weeks of the season starting. Now let me explain. Mythic Plus basically offers hero track items on completion of the dungeon of a plus 17 or above that you can upgrade to 483, same as the items that drop in the heroic version of the raid. As for the Great Vault, this offers Mythic Track items at 480 for a plus 18 or 483 for a plus 20, and the Mythic Raid also drops Mythic Track items ranging from 480 to 486. However, this time, all of these Mythic Track items can be upgraded all the way to 489 using Aspect Crests. What this means is that the Great Vault reward for doing a plus 18 is now effectively equivalent to the drops from Farok Mythic except for the 496 rare trinkets. And as for the loot from the Mythic Raid itself, you still need to spend 15, 30, or 45 of your weekly 90 Aspect Crests to upgrade it all the way. So what they essentially did is they throttled the gear increase you could get for the first few weeks to avoid a situation like in Season 2 where everyone was geared out of their mind in the first 2 weeks, while basically ensuring that everyone who can do a plus 18 will basically end up in the same place 5 to 6 weeks in, regardless of what other content they do or do not participate in. What I'm saying here is that all of these sources of gear and bad luck protection that have been slowly added over time, like cumulative cap on crests, vault, omni token, catalyst charges, sparks, reduced gap in item level between raid difficulties, they feel really good for the first few weeks as your character is getting really powerful really fast, but the end result is just a normalization of gear after the first few weeks of the season. Now think about it, after the first 5 weeks, between your 4 vaults, the hero gear you got from M+, using your first 2 crafting sparks and the Weirman aspect crests, you're looking at being roughly 484, 485 item level of the 489 maximum, and that's without touching the raid whatsoever. You can comfortably expect to be anywhere between 487 and 488 depending on your luck after the first 2.5 months. For reference, the Mythic Hall of Fame, that's the first 200 guilds in the world to manage to clear the raid on Mythic and kill Mythic Farok, was filled on February 3rd for this season, which is exactly about 2.5 months into the season. At this point, the only real upgrades in the raid, depending on your class, are maybe a trinket or one of the special rare items like the staff from Nimue or the trinkets from Farok. And while that may be an incentive for the most best-in-slot oriented people still playing the game, and yes, there are a lot of them, if you actually do the math, you're looking at an extra 3, maybe 4% increase in your character's performance at best at this point going forward. And I also find it ironic that a lot of these items that are the last lone reason to set foot into a raid on Heroic at least, are now also rare drops. So what will happen 6 weeks into the season is you'll see Heroic pickup groups filled with essentially bissed out characters that are only missing that one trinket only for it to drop once in a blue moon and then have 8 people rolling for it. Now clearly there are still people out there that enjoy raiding for the challenge and are still at it despite the lack of gearing incentive, but they're facing the design problems that this accelerated gearing direction has created or exacerbated. Again, let's look at the numbers. The Race to World First saw Echo, Liquid, and Method take down Mythic Farok after the first reset, but by that point, they had an average raid item level of 480. Remember, the maximum item level you can get throughout the course of the entire season is 489, and for reference, I was 476 at that point without doing heroic splits and without stepping foot into the raid on Mythic yet. Now, I'm only telling you this just so you see how small the gap has become between the literal best players in the world trying to get every little bit of advantage they can in order to win the race, and someone who just plays the game a decent amount without necessarily rushing straight for the hardest content right away. And even so, the last 2 bosses were extremely difficult for them to pull off, costing them upwards of 300 attempts each. Now yes, both of these bosses have been significantly nerfed since multiple times, but if you ask players that have been trying them in the meantime, while some of the nerfs definitely do make the fights more approachable, 4 months into the season, we are only 7 to 8 item levels higher than the literal best 60 players or so in the world when they killed the fight. You can see how this is a problem when Tindril needed to get a 10% HP nerf as recently as 14 days ago, because even after being nerfed both numerically and mechanically several times before, people were still having trouble with the DPS check in practically full BIS after 3.5 months into the season. And that's just the thing. Bosses used to be tuned so that the best guilds in the world would kill them early on with lower gear, and then as people slowly geared up throughout the course of the content cycle, you would eventually reach a point where more gear would somewhat trivialize some of the mechanics that made the bosses so bleeding edge difficult to execute for the best players in the world. But now, because of the accelerated pace of gearing, the bosses are tuned to be barely killable by the best players in the world in relatively higher item level gear, which means that the only way that the rest of us have a realistic shot at beating them is to wait for Blizzard to nerf them and pray that they nerf the right thing. Take Tindril for example, the second to last boss. The main difficulty of the fight on Mythic is managing a lot of individual assignments that if failed will result in a raid wipe. I thought we decided these were bad back in Sepulchre, but apparently we forgot in the meantime again. Anyway, so the tank doesn't make it to the green mushroom in time, raid wipe. One of the 6 people assigned to doing feathers misses an orb, raid wipe. Dispelled too soon, raid wipe. Person with the debuff dies before getting dispelled, raid wipe. Didn't step on all the seeds within 5 seconds, raid wipe. You get the idea. None of these mechanics get any easier as people gear up and are in some cases just as difficult to execute in 489 item level as they would be in 480. And that's why the bosses have to be nerfed so much. And it's also why weak aura packages have become basically mandatory for coordinating on some of these bosses, because more gear doesn't really simplify anything at all. Some of the last bosses in the last 2 tiers, namely Echo of Neltharion, Tindril, and Farok, required insane weak auras that use multiple class priority lists, place numbers on your raid frames, and even hack the secondary minimap to visually show people their location assignment for some of these mechanics that are extremely hard, if not downright impossible, to coordinate otherwise. And all in all, stuff like this is why so many guilds are having trouble with Tindral and Thurok, and between this and the first 7 bosses offering minimal if any gear upgrades after the first few weeks, most guilds just end up extending the save because they need all the time they can to progress on these last bosses that still take hundreds of pulls to get right even after being nerfed so many times. In my raid, for example, we had everyone in a 30-man roster at the start of the season with full tier set bonus after 3 weeks, so we stopped doing normal. And the only reason we were still doing heroic skips at this point was to give the plate classes their chance to spend $500,000 gold, or $30, on crafting the legendary axe, which was indeed a big boost. Now, 3 or 4 weeks later, we had no impactful upgrades from the first 6 bosses either, since everyone was 485 or above at this point, and that's with half the roster doing 4 or even 1 mythic plus each week. So we just started extending the saves because we only raid for 4 days a week, and we needed all the time we could get to progress on Smolderon, Tindral, and Thurok. Okay, so after looking at all that, let's just assume that you only care about making your character stronger and nothing else. If you look at how this works and plan ahead, you have 2 choices. On the one hand, at the start of the season, you can just decide to stick to pugging 4 or 8 18s each week and be 485 item level in about 6 weeks, 487 in 2 months, and probably 488 if not 489 with a bit of luck by the end of the season. And that's by playing 4 to 5 hours each week on a flexible schedule with no fixed time commitments. On the other hand, you have the raids. And sure, maybe you'll pug heroic or even normal for the first few weeks to see if you can get a specific trinket or see if you can get that tier bonus 1 week earlier. But apart from that, why would you commit to a fixed raiding roster for heroic, where the only upgrade is probably 1 rare drop trinket, or mythic, where you have to install 5 weak aura packages and another 15 mandatory add-ons, only to end up in no time extending the save for weeks and weeks and weeks on the same boss that was tuned to be difficult to kill for the best 100 players in the world, with only 7 to 8 item levels lower than you will ever get. At this point, you're just basically hitting your head against the wall while waiting and praying that Blizzard nerfs it and knows what to nerf and doesn't just randomly do something that invalidates the strategy that you've been trying to perfect for the last 4 weeks, for example. And remember, we're talking about someone who only cares about character power. For what? A plate class like myself has literally 0 upgrades from the last 2 bosses on Mythic except for the 496 Augury trinket. And at that point, the season is already over, and outside maybe the top 200 guilds, you probably won't be doing re-clears anyway since everyone is exhausted from clearing it the first time, and you probably don't have any more upgrades you can get from those bosses at this point anyway. Oh, and if you're thinking that you might at least have a head start once the new season drops, well, that's completely gone out the window now, because historically getting full Mythic Bis at least meant that you were on par with the normal raid when it dropped and you could go straight to Heroic for upgrades. But if they keep the same item level gap that they increased from Season 2 to Season 3, you're basically looking at your Mythic Bis gear being LFR gear in the new season, and you can probably actually get the same level of gear by doing World Quest or some community or weekly events when the new season starts. When you put it that way, it doesn't sound like much of a choice, does it? Sure, there are other reasons to want to do it, like accomplishment or bragging rights or seeing who's more skilled. But you have to understand, that's the only thing left at this point. The same way the push to expedite leveling pushed away the people that wanted to slowly level up their character and adventure through a living, breathing world, this direction is now basically alienating the people that want to feel their character getting more powerful as they push through harder content. Now, I'm not saying that I think this is a good idea or even that I want them to do this, but at this point, following the logic of people that say get good and skills are the only thing that should matter, the same way that they sell a level 70 character boost so you don't have to go through leveling, why don't they just sell you a 489 item level boost so you don't have to go through gearing? And at that point, everyone's on a level playing field and you can just see who pushes buttons best. You might want to play League of Legends or a first-person shooter. I don't know, just saying. And at that point, this wouldn't really be an MMORPG anymore in my eyes at least, but this seems to be the direction we're going in anyway, so why not just speed things up and finish the job? Now, me personally, I'm still pulling on Thurok Mythic right now, but we have consistently had roster issues for 2 tiers, especially after the first couple of months. And on top of this, we have at least 4 people that aren't pulling their full weight. I love you guys, but usually the on switch to your monitor is located somewhere on the bottom right side of your screen. On top of this, we're running a very suboptimal roster in terms of class composition because we have spent weeks spamming chat looking for specific classes that would make the fight easier and we barely get anyone interested. And when we do get somebody, they usually don't stick around for 2 or 3 weeks of pulling the same boss for hundreds of times. And both of these problems weren't that big in the past because you could just compensate as time went on with higher gear, and you didn't need everyone to be parsing purples or oranges, and you didn't need to make sure you had every single class buff in the game. But now, with only 7 or 8 item level margin, that's not really the case anymore, and the only way forward is waiting for a nerf. I don't know, maybe this will get better with Cross Realm Mythic from day one in the War Within, which is definitely really good and way overdue. But that doesn't really address the gearing and design issues, and if they keep the same direction, normal rating is basically irrelevant after the first couple of weeks. Heroic will become really easy for veteran and good players really fast as they gear up. And ironically, these people are probably the ones that can get the same, if not better, gear from just doing Mythic Plus on their own. And as for the Mythic version of the raid, well, that pretty much only depends on nerfs for the second half of the raid to be accessible for even some of the most hardcore players, while offering little to no reward in terms of gear. The truth is, this was meant to be an MMORPG, and character power progression is an integral part of it. If the game is going to fully commit to the seasonal content reset cycle, which it has now for quite some time, then you can't unfortunately just accelerate the pace of gearing, remove gearing as an incentive to raid, add in a 30-minute quest line and a hourly community event that gives 1 to 5 mounts every 2 months, and just hope to prolong the content until the next season by just making it tuned so tight that the people take months to kill it in full bis only for the achievement and the bragging rights and to see who has the bigger skills. A lot of people will just quit. And maybe you won't, but there's not that many of us left, and the reasons to come back are getting fewer and fewer with how the gearing has evolved and the general design philosophy of releasing fights that are extremely difficult mechanically and then slowly nerfing them throughout the course of the season. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents. The rant went on longer than I was expecting, and please let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, subscribe if you like the video. And I hope to see you again in the next one. Until then, have a good one and try to stay sane. Bye-bye.